Welcome to Rewatch-and-Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is Hannibal, Season 1, Episode 2, Amuse-Bouche. And now for our episode in a nutshell, which is just a short summary of what happens in the episode. Will deals with the aftermath of killing Garrett Jacob Hobbs while being targeted by an unethical reporter and attempting to solve a case where the killer plants mushrooms. And then now we will do a more detailed summary of the episode while giving our opinions on each scene. Muffled gunshots ring out as casings fall to the ground. It then pans up to show Will shooting at a target, and as he brings the target closer to check his accuracy, as it approaches, it morphs into Garrett Jacob Hobbs, and Will panics, emptying another round of bullets into him and also into the target, as we know that he isn't real. This scene, again, very short, opening up the episode, showing that Will has some trauma associated with having killed Garrett Jacob Hobbs. Jack knocks on the car window, waking up Will, who is sleeping. They then enter Garrett's hunting cabin filled with recent deer kills. Will makes his way upstairs and finds the antler room. The antler room is, as you would expect it, a room with antlers on every single surface that's available. And Will comments that it could be a permanent installation in Jack's Evil Minds Museum. Jack then says what they learned from this case will help them to catch future killers. He then also comments that there's still 7 bodies missing, and Will points out that Garrett Jacob Hobbs was eating them. Jack then proposes that Garrett had help committing his crimes, as kidnapping, killing, and disposing of the bodies without leaving any evidence is a lot of work for one person to handle. Will puts his back up, starts getting suspicious, and asks if Abigail is a suspect. And Jack reiterates that Garrett spent a lot of time hunting with Abigail, according to their neighbors, and she would make ideal bait for luring the girls. Will tells him that Garrett Jacob Hobbs killed alone, and then finds a long red hair on the ground by some of the antlers, noting that someone else was there. We then change scenes over to Freddie uploading pictures and updating her Tattle Crime website. With this scene, again, the imagery is amazing. The antler room is very aesthetically designed. And then also, as I have questioned even in the last episode, or foreshadowed in the last episode, I don't really get Will's attachment to Abigail. They literally at this point have had no contact behind him besides him failing to put pressure on her neck, and yet he's going to bat for her, he's defending her staunchly, he's not even considering a quite reasonable assumption that she could have potentially been helping her dad as bait, or not even realizing she was helping her dad, but maybe going out and him using her as bait without her knowledge. And it's odd to me because I don't understand this connection he's formed to her when he's literally had no contact at this point. Will gets applause from his students as he enters the classroom in order to give a presentation on how he caught Garrett Jacob Hobbs. He shows a slide with Garrett's resignation letter, asking if anybody sees the clue, before he reveals that there isn't one. It's just that he left a phone number and no address, and he calls it dumb luck. Then a slide shows Garrett's body, and Will flashes back to trying to save Abigail. He then tells the class that the question now is how to stop those he'll inspire. The projector then changes to show a picture of Cassie's body, as Will points out that he already has one copycat. This scene's purpose, in my opinion, is simply to recap the last episode, and also to remind us that Will actually, his real job, is to be a teacher at the academy, a lecturer. It's not actually supposed to be in the field, though, as we'll see in this series more and more, it does become that he is more of a field agent than a teacher, but this is just a nice little break to remind us that he actually should just be a teacher. Alana hurries in as Will's class lets out, asking how he is before warning that he's about to be ambushed, as Jack also enters right behind her. Jack asks how his class was, and Will tells him about the applause and how he thought it was inappropriate. Jack then says that he's up for commendation and has been okayed for the field, but Alana asks him if he wants to go back into the field. But then Jack interrupts her, saying he wants him in the field and has recommended a psych evaluation. Will looks to Alana, asking if they're starting now, but she quickly says that it wouldn't be with her, but rather with Hannibal, as their relationship is less personal. But Will says that he isn't comfortable with anyone in his head. Alana then brings up that it's Will's first kill, and he reminds her that his previous job was as a cop in homicide. But then Jack decides to remind him that he left that job because he didn't have the stomach to pull the trigger, and now he shot a man 10 times. Will realizes that the evaluation isn't just a formality, with Jack saying that it's to let him sleep at night, knowing he didn't let him get too close. Will claims that therapy doesn't work on him, and Jack says that's because he won't let it. But Will says, again, that he knows all of the tricks, which is why it doesn't work on him, before he starts heading to the door. Jack then tells him that he needs to unlearn the tricks, while Elena encourages him to just have a conversation with Hannibal, since she points out that he also was there and will be the best person to understand what was happening. So obviously, blindsiding somebody, never a good idea, but the request that's being made here is extremely reasonable. He has killed somebody, it's the first time he's killed somebody, so even just having somebody to talk to act as a sounding board for your feelings and your thoughts, is not a bad idea. I do, though, question Jack's motivations here. They seem very selfish. Jack wants to know that he didn't get too close. Jack wants to be able to sleep at night. Jack wants to make sure he hasn't broken his investigator. Alana is the one who seems to be really on Will's side here, but even she's agreeing with Jack about the reasonable request to see Hannibal and get a psych evaluation. So there is that. Will is now in Hannibal's office and he's looking at the shelves filled with books from the balcony of Hannibal's office. He then asks what Hannibal has in his hands, and we can see that Hannibal is holding a piece of paper. Hannibal says that it's his psychological evaluation, declaring him competent. Will then, in somewhat disbelief, asks if he's just been rubber stamped. Hannibal tells him that it will allow Jack to sleep and allow their conversation to proceed unobstructed by paperwork. Will tells him that Jack thinks he needs therapy, while Hannibal says that he needs a way out of dark places that Jack sends him into. Will says the last time he brought something back from that dark place, and Hannibal suggests it's a surrogate daughter, saying that saving her life and orphaning her comes with emotional obligations, which he also feels the weight of. And Will nods before revealing Jack's theory that Abigail helped her dad with the murders. Hannibal asks the cliché, "How does that make you feel?" And then Will throws it back at him, asking how Hannibal feels. Hannibal says that it's vulgar, and Will agrees, but then Hannibal adds that it's also entirely possible, while Will says that it's absolutely not. Hannibal says that they'll find out when she wakes up, before telling Will that the mirrors in his mind can reflect the best of himself, not the worst of somebody else. So at this point, they're trying to explain why Abigail is important, why Will is so concerned about her. Hannibal offering up the reason that it's because Will is the one who orphaned her, he's feeling emotional obligations. Even then, I still feel like Will's feelings towards her are strong, but then he does have that empathy disorder, which is the whole premise of the show, his disorder helping him solve crimes. So that may be why he's feeling it so strongly, because even Hannibal has enough distance, although he could also be lying about the obligation given that he's Hannibal, but is more distant enough to say that it is a possibility she could have helped her dad, whereas Will is completely on Abigail's side, not saying anything. And again, they haven't spoken to her. She's still in a coma. The only contact that Will has had with her was when he was trying and failing to put pressure on her wound. I also like the way that in this scene, Will's up on a balcony, Hannibal's down in his office, and Will has to talk down at Hannibal while Hannibal has to look up at him while they're having their conversation. And that brings me on to our aesthetics. As I said, my favorite part of this show is the aesthetics, the imagery, and this office has a balcony right there it wins points. But it also has this huge desk. It has multiple little seating areas so that a patient can sit in whichever area they feel most comfortable in. It's so well decorated. It's so grand. It's beautiful. It's Hannibal in a nutshell, and it's a beautiful office. We now get around to addressing the case for this issue. This episode, sorry. We have boys hiking through the woods, having a great time, playing together, and then they find a mushroom field. They debate if someone's growing drugs, which fair, some mushrooms can be hallucinogenic, but then they notice that there are tons of tubes. Before following those tubes and seeing that all of those tubes connect to multiple human hands that are sticking up out of the ground. It's a short scene. They found the killing field, therefore, or the dumping field, therefore, setting off our case for this episode. And again, it's the imagery. They're walking through the woods. They find a little area. It looks at first like, oh, a field of mushrooms. How nice and wonderful. Mushrooms are amazing. They are my favorite food, and they have been my favorite food practically since birth. Since I started eating non-baby food, mushrooms. They've been my favorite food. They still are even after this episode. Hasn't impacted that. But I love mushrooms. So a field of mushrooms, I'm automatically happy. I like the scene for that reason. But also the imagery of just slowly kind of easing you into the fact that these mushrooms are hiding bodies by first showing you the mushroom fields and you don't really notice any hands or anything. Then it shows the tubes and then it makes you follow the tubes down to where you then realize, oh, there's bodies there. I think it was really well done. And again, the imagery and the fact that they chose mushrooms gets a positive from me. We now see Will again at the firing range, taking shots at a target when Beverly arrives and comments that his firearm accuracy isn't a prerequisite for his teaching job. And Will points out that he's been in the field and points out that it took 10 shots to drop Hobbs. While switching out the targets, Beverly says that Brian wanted to give him the bullets in an acrylic case, which she says wouldn't have been funny, but that she had suggested making them into one of those clacky swinging ball things. And Will agrees that that would have been funny before he moves to shoot again. She then comments on his stance coming up behind him, and he tells her he uses the stance he does due to getting stabbed in the shoulder while he was a cop. And then Beverly adjusts his stance, telling him about getting stabbed with pencil in school and telling him to see if that helps with the recoil. Will then shoots again, bringing the target close again to see the results, confirming that his accuracy was better, and asking if she was sent to help him shoot, but then she denies it and says that Jack sent her in order to find out what he knows about gardening. I do like that in this scene, Beverly and Will are starting to get to know each other a little bit better. They do end up, in the future, she's somebody that he comes to rely on. So I do like that this is showing them starting to get familiar, starting to get friendly, and she is the forensic person that he is the closest to. I failed to mention it, I think, under the ambush scene, but we also are learning more about Will's past in this episode, about the fact that he used to be a cop, that he used to be in homicide, in active duty, yet somehow he passed the screening to be a cop, but he didn't pass the screening to be an FBI agent. And I have to wonder how different they are, because in theory, hopefully, you would want both your cops and your FBI agents to be very stable. I also think that it's clever to ask him what he knows about gardening, given the nature of the murder that we are solving in this episode. The crime scene has now been dug up. It is now an active crime scene, and Beverly removes the tape from the mouth of one of the bodies, and it brings up the skin with it, showing how rotted and decayed all of the skin is. Will and Jack then arrive, with Jack bringing up Hannibal, having gave the all clear, saying that therapy might work on him after all. But then Will tells him that it's an acquired taste he hasn't acquired. But it has served Jack's purpose, and he is now back in the field as Jack wanted. Jack then tells him of tracks and traps found around the area, which Will says is to keep his crop undisturbed. His crop meaning the killer's crop, undisturbed. Jimmy then tells them that they have 9 bodies in various stages of decay, while Beverly adds that they are buried in a high nutrient compost. Brian then chimes in and notes that they're buried alive, with the intention of keeping them that way, and that they were fed something through IVs, which is why there were all the tubes going down into their arms. Will asks if there were any restraints, but it's confirmed that there weren't any, and Beverly also notes that they were given an air supply. Then Jack says welcome back before they clear out, leaving Will alone with the bodies so that he can do his empathy thing. Off to the side, we see Freddie again, secretly taking pictures. And then she lies to a cop to get information from the cops, pretending to be a parent of one of the boys that found the bodies. She's especially interested in Will, who she's told is a special consultant for the FBI. Back with Will, the pendulum swings, and the garden goes backwards. Will then narrates what he feels that the killer was thinking. So Will says that he doesn't need restraints, burying the victim in a shallow grave, knowing he won't be conscious again as he imagines burying him. He then says that they're not going to know that they're dying, but he doesn't need them to. That is his design. The body in the grave then changes to become Garrett Jacob Hobbs, and this startles him. An officer points out to Freddie, so the one that she was speaking with, points out to Freddie that the families are leaving, but Freddie dismisses him while staring at Will, saying that they drove in separately. Will is kneeled on the ground next to the body, seeming to have some sort of fit, shaking a bit. And then one of the bodies wakes up, and Will, who happens to be kneeling next to this body, is grabbed as everyone rushes over because one of them's alive. So, my first commentary on this scene, and I do have a little bit to say about it. First commentary is this is a particularly cruel way of killing people, I think. The fact that they're left alive while their body literally decays while they're alive. Now, fair, they're in a coma, but in comas, it's still unknown how much a person is aware of while in a coma. Some people think that they can hear, some people think that they can't. It's still up in the air. From what I've seen from any other shows or just around on YouTube and such, as far as I'm aware, in a coma, people still are not sure exactly how much consciousness there is for patients. So if you imagine that they could hear or maybe have some sort of consciousness there, that is extremely cruel. There's also the fact that we get jump scared a bit when one of them just randomly wakes up and we're like, oh my gosh, did not see that coming. A very good scare. But also, back to the cruelty, and this ties in, that person who just woke up is also the one that Beverly ripped the mouth off of because the skin was so rotted and decayed that it had a better time sticking to the tape than it did the body. At that point, I don't even know if I would want to be saved. If I woke up to that, that'd be the most painful way to die. Hopefully, you would die quickly. But like, how would you even save somebody whose skin is literally rotted to that extent with mushrooms growing all over their body? And for that to come back to consciousness, to have that be your consciousness just before leaving, it's horrifying. I still like mushrooms though. And then the last part, of course, is that we're now learning about Freddie, and we're seeing just how unethical of a reporter that she is. We already knew that she broke into a crime scene, so we knew that she was unethical, but now she's also lying to cops. Now she's also fishing for stories in places that she shouldn't be. And we're once again reminded that this is a dislikable character. I feel like she's meant to be, since she's kind of a minor antagonist type role in the show. But her ethics, they just don't exist. Following our jump scare at the crime scene, which is probably even worse for Will, Will gives Hannibal back his rubber stamp, putting it on his desk in his office, saying that it may have been given to him premature. Hannibal then asks him what happened in the field, and Will says that he saw a hallucination of Garrett Jacob Hobbs lying in someone else's grave. Hannibal dismisses it as stress and not worth reporting, saying that he replaced the killer's victim with what could arguably be considered his own victim. Will protests that he doesn't consider Hobbs his victim, just that he considers him dead. And Hannibal then asks if it's harder imagining the thrill somebody else feels killing now that he's done it himself. After a pause, Will nods his head, and Hannibal moves on, approaching Will and changing the subject to discuss the current case. He asks about why the arms are exposed, asking if it was to hold them or feel the life leave their bodies. Will claims that that doesn't fit, as the killer is more practical than that. Hannibal then says he was cultivating them, but let the crops die. He let all of the crops die except one, which Will reveals died on the way to the hospital, thank goodness. Though he points out that the people were just fertilizer, and the mushrooms were the crop. Hannibal tells him that the structure of fungus is like the human brain, a web of connections, and Will speculates that the killer admires the ability to connect the way that human minds can't, that the mushrooms possess. Hannibal then says that Will's brain can connect that way, making Will laugh, before Hannibal then asks if that's what the killer is looking for, some sort of connection. Now this is mostly an exposition scene, where they're basically working on that profile with Hannibal as a sounding board for the case. However, I do find it very interesting, and I'm sure given the aesthetics of the show and how important the imagery in this show is, that there was a reason for it. But when Hannibal and Will are talking about Will, Hannibal is standing with the desk between him and Will. But then when they start moving on to more third-party topics like the crime scene, Hannibal then goes around the table and approaches Will, and they talk face to face in rather close proximity. I feel like it's worth noting because I do feel that that was a very intentional choice that the people who wrote the show made, to have that distance and that obstacle between them when it's personal, but then becoming closer when it's less personal for Will. We then, while still at Hannibal's office, show Freddie holding a recorder to the door as Hannibal says goodbye to Will behind the door. We don't see it, but we hear it. Hannibal then walks over to let her into the room and calls her Miss Kimball, letting her in by a different door than Will left out of. He then follows her through the room as she looks around. At first, Freddie pretends that she's a patient, and he asks her why she's seeking out therapy now. She then turns it around, not answering the question, and asks if she can ask questions first, and then brings up his work on social exclusion. This leads to him asking if she is Freddie Lowndes, which she doesn't deny. He then tells her that this is unethical, even for a tabloid journalist, asking for her bag, which she at first is reluctant to give, and he needs to ask her several times before saying that he'd rather not have to take it from her. Freddie passes over her bag reluctantly, and Hannibal thanks her before opening it to see the recorder. She then admits to recording their conversation, and he clarifies with her that it was just theirs, no other conversations. And she denies it at first, but then he brings up how insistent she was on her appointment time and asking how she knew Will would be there, but she refuses to answer and give away her source. Hannibal then goes over and sits on a nice powder blue couch and invites her to come sit beside him, patting the place next to him as if he's talking to a child. He then tells her to delete the conversations that she's recorded, as doctor-patient confidentiality works both ways. He hands her the device, then, once she seemingly deletes the messages, he returns the recorder to her bag and sets it aside. He then tells her that she's been terribly rude and asks what's to be done about that. So in this scene, I don't understand why Hannibal didn't just kill her. I have talked myself around to it. I would suspect the only thing that would have saved her life in this scenario is, well, two things. Either Hannibal thinks that she can help him get closer to Will, which is currently his goal, and therefore he'll let her do what she's going to do and write about Will and investigate Will so that that can then be used to his advantage. Or number two, somebody told her when Will's appointment would be. There is a leak somewhere, and somebody out there knows that she's visiting Hannibal. So if she was to then randomly disappear, somebody out there, and they don't know who, would be able to make Hannibal a suspect. And I suspect that is probably why he didn't kill her. But given that Hannibal kills rude people, I feel like this would have put her on his list to be killed at some point. But I also, Freddie is such a dislikable character. Her lack of ethics makes her really intolerable to a certain extent. So I kind of wish that Hannibal had taken care of the problem before it became a problem. But again, I've given two reasons why he may not have. We then enter another aesthetic scene where red sauce is poured over white meat, while Hannibal introduces the dish as loin, served with a Cumberland sauce of red fruits. When Jack asks the kind of loin, Hannibal claims that it's pork. Whether it actually is, we'll never know. Jack then mentions how he doesn't eat home cooking often, mentioning both his wife and mother cooked, but he really wishes that they didn't. Hannibal then suggests bringing his wife next time they have dinner and changes the topic to Will. Jack asks why Will came back to see him, and Hannibal says that Will recognizes the need for support while he is in the field, but Jack says a guy like Will knows exactly what's going on inside of his head, which is why he doesn't want anyone else up there. Hannibal then makes an analogy to horses, claiming that Jack is afraid of Will being a broken pony, asking if he's ever lost someone in the field before. Jack then confirms that he has lost somebody before, and Hannibal asks if he's so delicate with Will because he doesn't trust him, or because he's afraid of losing another pony. Jack says that he already has had his psych evaluation, but Hannibal points out that he hasn't had one made by him. and pointing out that he's already told him about his mother, so why stop there? Hannibal and Jack then clink their wine glasses, as Jack laughs before drinking. I do question the ethics here about talking about Will behind his back. In this scene, it's more focused on Jack and Jack's behavior towards Will, so I don't think that there's any patient-doctor confidentiality being breached in this case. But Jack does ask why Will would have come back, and I don't know that you could give the reason for that without it being somewhat unethical with the patient-doctor confidentiality, because at this point, Will's going on his own. It's not related to Jack anymore, so he really shouldn't have any information at all. And then Hannibal points out that Jack was delicate with Will. Every scene that I've seen so far, I haven't seen Jack being delicate. Like, I don't pick that up in the series, and I'm not sure what exactly the scenario they're referencing is. I mean, when Jack leaves him alone at a crime scene, he usually speaks softly, but I would assume that's because he wants to get Will into the mindset to do his pendulum swinging and get into the mindset of the killer. I don't see that as him being delicate with him, and obviously he's let him get too close already. He's still insistent on Will being in the field, even though he knows it could cause him harm. None of these things read to me as him being delicate with Will and being afraid to break his pony, given that he's already kind of started to break his pony. So that part of the conversation to me is a lost cause because it doesn't make sense to me personally. Will next checks in with the lab about any new evidence that they may have found from the bodies. Jimmy says that they were fertilized with a mixture of hardwood, shredded newspaper, and pig poop, which is perfect for growing mushrooms. Brian then notes that they all died of kidney failure, and Beverly adds that the IVs were filled with sugar water, which mushrooms tend to crave. Will confirms the death by kidney failure, claiming that it was actually death by diabetic ketoacidosis. Beverly asks Brian if he knew that they were diabetics, and he says they don't know that, but Will is sure that they were diabetics, and that the comas were induced by changing out their medications, saying that they are looking for a doctor or pharmacist. Brian comments that they dug up his mushroom garden, while Will warns that that means the killer will want to grow a new one. Once again, we get to see an intuitive leap made by Will that's born more out of his empathy than necessarily the evidence. But again, I have a criticism. I have a question. Where did he get the medical knowledge to realize the diabetic's reaction to the sugar water link? Yet he didn't know how to provide pressure to a wound in order to save Abigail or her mother. As far as I'm aware, his background is as a cop. Even if he got first aid, it would make more sense for him to know how to put pressure on a wound because that's first aid, and I feel like a cop would usually have some basic first aid training like that, or slightly more than basic in case, they were shot in the field or something like that. I've watched some body cam footage in the past. I've seen that they have like their little kit and they do things like that. So he was a cop before. He should have the basic first aid to help with a wound. But in the case of like this medical knowledge about diabetics, he's not diabetic. He's not been a doctor. He's not been trained. I would expect maybe Hannibal to be able to make that connection because he used to be a medical doctor, a surgeon. But Will doesn't have a medical background. So how is he putting together the pieces of like the diabetics immediately? I mean, I think that goes beyond just he's empathetic to he must be psychic because he doesn't, as far as I can tell, so far in the series, have that medical background to know all of the medical ways that somebody might die of kidney failure and be able to pinpoint, oh, diabetic ketoacidosis. That's what it is. They're all diabetic. And then you must be looking for a pharmacist or a doctor. It's just something that I question and I critique a bit because we, as the audience, haven't been given the foundation to know how he would know it. Gretchen walks into her local pharmacy to pick up her prescription. Eldon, who is the pharmacist, notes that it's for insulin and then goes to get her bag where the medication is already set aside. But then when he looks at it, he tells her, "Oops, it's the wrong one." And then he goes to a fridge and swaps out her medication, giving her the actual wrong medication. She thanks him, signing that she's received her medication, confirming her address before leaving. Eldon then continues to assist customers while quietly SWAT team starts to surround the store. And I believe the pharmacy is in a grocery store, so they're surrounding the entire grocery store. Jack and Will then make their way to the pharmacy section of the store, while Jack advises that all of the victims disappeared from the same chain, while a floater employee, Eldon, was working there. And it's still showing that Eldon is signed in at his station. So as they arrive, Jack holds up his badge and yells for the pharmacist to stop what they're doing, asking which one of them is Eldon Stamets. One of the pharmacists working there says that he was just there, but has left already, and Will asks if his car is still in the parking lot. The pharmacist then leads them over to the parking lot, where Will breaks the car window before popping the trunk, and we find that Gretchen is in a coma, buried in fertilizer in the trunk. They hold their nose because the fertilizer is apparently smelling horrific, and Will calls out that she is alive, and then Jack calls for the EMTs. They then confirm that they know the killer's name, they have the killer's address, and now they also have the killer's car. Then Jimmy arrives saying that they've checked his station's browser history and they should come and see it. So they all return into the pharmacy where Beverly is looking at the Tattle Crime article about Will that Freddie Lowndes has posted, saying that the FBI. So the headline is that the FBI is using one to catch other killers. She then stops and says that the article goes into a lot of detail. While Jack slams his fist into the counter in frustration, and Will kind of stares off to the side. So the first comment I want to make is if SWAT was surrounding the entire building and sneaking in, covering the exits and entrances, why or how did Eldon get out? Like, did he happen to notice them coming up the road through a window? But from where the set looks, like what the set looks like, where the pharmacy is, it doesn't look like there's a window. So I don't know how he would have known that they were coming to be there just before they got there and then gone when they actually do get there. So I feel like that's kind of a continuity, not a continuity error. I'm not going to count it as that, but it's kind of, I feel like, an oversight. The second comment is along similar lines. It seemed like Gretchen came in during the day. Now it's nighttime. He confirmed her address, presumably so that he could pick her up once she had gone into a coma, but now she's already in his trunk. So why did he make a special point of confirming her address if he was able to just grab her from the parking lot? And I'm not diabetic, and I don't know anybody who's gone into a diabetic coma, though I do know people who are diabetic. But how long exactly would it take for someone to go into a coma? Can they go into a coma the same day that you switch out their medications? The way the scenes are shot back to back, it almost implies that it's just later the same day, not that a specific amount of time has passed. But she was perfectly fine when she picked up the medication. Now she's in the trunk of the car in a coma. I don't know how quickly one would end up in a coma from just getting the wrong medications. I guess it would depend on how severe of a diabetic they are. But I feel like when I was watching the scene, I was kind of confused about how she ended up in the car already when it seemed like only half a day had passed and how she's already in a coma. And the show never really explains that or goes into detail. And I'm left thinking, are we assuming that multiple days have passed and now the SWAT is there? Or are we assuming it's later the same day? Because it doesn't clarify, it doesn't do a very good transition as far as the timing. We now briefly get a quick glimpse of Hannibal reading the article at his desk in his office, and then he tells basically speaks to himself, saying that Freddy is being naughty before we switch over to actually show Freddy, who's in a dank motel bathroom, as someone knocks on the door. She calls out for who it is when the FBI charges in, tying her hands with zip ties so that Jack can come in and interrogate her. They basically throw her down, put on the zip ties, lift her up, and then stand guarding her as Jack basically comes in to loom over her in an intimidating fashion. She keeps calm, saying that he can't arrest her for writing an article, and he tells her that she entered a federal crime scene without permission. She says that she was escorted, and he said because she lied. She says that lying isn't a crime. He then pulls out one of her hairs, telling her that the unfortunate timing of your article allowed a murderer to escape, and then he tells her that she left a hair in the shrike's nest, which is what they are calling Hobbs's cabin, and that she had contaminated the crime scene. That counts as obstructing justice, and he can indict her for it. She then says that she'd prefer that he didn't do that, and he says that if she doesn't write any more about Will, he won't have to. He and the other agents then leave the scene, and Brian goes up to her in order to cut the zip ties off, and then as he does so, he accuses her of using him. Now, obviously, this implies that the reason the article was so detailed is that she had insider information, and with this, it's being revealed to the audience that Brian was most likely that leak, the one who was giving her that information, the detailed information about Will. But they don't really follow up on that further or show any further connection between the two. So this is basically where it ends. They just let us know this is probably the leak. And then again, a little bit of a criticism. When I watch for these videos, like when I rewatch specifically for these videos, I'm watching with a critical and analytical eye, and I notice things that honestly most people, myself included in former watches, never really picked up on. And this is one of those things. They want Freddy there to be kind of like a minor antagonist to Will throughout this story and this series. Because they want her there, they don't take actions like Hannibal let her live, even though his whole premise is that he kills people who are rude because he sees them as no better than pigs. She was incredibly rude, but he lets her go. Like I said, there could be other reasons for that one, but here we have Jack again. She did contaminate a crime scene. She did go into a crime scene she shouldn't have had access to. Even if she was escorted in, she contaminated it by leaving a hair there. Here he is using that as a blackmail threat. Write more articles, we'll arrest you. But why isn't he arresting her? She did do that. She did obstruct justice by contaminating a crime scene she had no business being in. And if that is, in fact, like Jack says, an arrestable offense, she should be arrested. It shouldn't be blackmail. It should be, you are being arrested right now. So I don't understand really the choice to just let her go or just use the blackmail. Especially since, as those of us rewatching who know the future know, the blackmail did absolutely nothing. But you shouldn't just pick and choose which criminals that you arrest. If she contaminated a crime scene, if that's an arrestable offense, she should be arrested. Point blank, period. Do not pass go. That should be the case. It should not be held as something that he's using for blackmail, in my opinion. Will sits in the hospital watching Abigail, who is still in a coma. He glances briefly outside the door as a stag walks past the door. It then switches and shows him sleeping as Alana walks in, taking off her high heels so that she doesn't wake him with the clacking. Back in the dream sequence, Will follows the stag into the hall, and we see that it has a feathered rump. As it turns a corner, while in reality, Alana covers up Will's sleeping body with a blanket. At this point, The dream ends and Will actually wakes up in reality to find that Alana is reading to Abigail. Alana mentions the book she's reading is from her past, and when she was young, she really liked it, and she had tried to raise peacocks because the main character in the book raised peacocks, but that they were really stupid birds. Will then says that she could be reading to a killer, and she tells him that innocent until proven guilty still applies. She then hesitantly brings up the article, and he asks if Jack sent her, but she says that she sent herself. He changes the topic to point out that they've never been alone in a room together, which Alana had also mentioned in episode 1, but she says that she hasn't noticed, trying to play dumb about it, and points out that Abigail happens to be there. So technically they aren't really alone, though I'm not sure somebody in a coma counts. She then gives Will an out, saying that they don't have to talk about it, and he says that he was enjoying her reading, basically implying that he does not want to talk about it. Alana then brings the topic back to Abigail, saying that Abigail is a win for him because he happened to save her life, though again, I kind of disagree because he wasn't doing very well at saving her. It was Hannibal stepping in that saved her life. Will was just actively holding her neck while she was bleeding out. But I digress. He then comes back and says that she doesn't look like a success because she is still in a coma, so she's not technically been fully saved yet. Elena then implies that he feels sorry for himself, but he corrects her saying that he feels good, not sorry, for himself. Now, Alana calls peacocks stupid birds. I completely disagree. Or it depends on what she meant by stupid. If she meant like their intelligence level, I don't know about that. But if she meant that just in general that they were stupid birds, like stupid looking, stupid acting, or just stupid birds, I disagree because peacocks happen to be my absolute favorite bird of all time. Even in their molting stage, when they're bald and they no longer have their train, I still think that they are beautiful birds just in their facial area. Like, like the beautiful like head and neck feathers, the little flounce they have at the top, and then when they have their train and they spread it, absolutely incredible. Beautiful, beautiful birds. My favorite birds. My favorite food is mushrooms. To say that this episode is liked by me because it has so many of my favorite things in it, mentioned in it, well, it is my favorite. One of my favorite episodes and one of my most memorable episodes for that reason. But going back to my comment on the actual scene and not my personal opinions on peacocks, I do find at the beginning I both like and I dislike that dream sequence where they flip between dreams and reality because they don't put a lot of transition on the screen, so it's hard to tell when they're moving from dream to reality and back to dream and then back to reality again. Of course, when the stag is there, you know it's a dream, but until the stag appears, he could be awake or he could be asleep. But I also think that that's also what makes the scene good, in that you do have that questioning of, is he awake now? Or is he still dreaming? Is Alana really there? Is she part of the dream too? We haven't really gotten a transition. Are we both, like, are we completely in a dream here? Or are we going back and forth? And I think that questioning was intentional. So I like that they did that. I thought that that was very atmospheric, shall we say. But the lack of transition is also annoying because then you're questioning, are we in reality? Are we in a dream? So that's my opinion and commentary on that particular aspect of this scene. We then get another aesthetic piece of imagery with a coffee. Like, so basically there's a black screen and then we see white dripping into it and then swirling around and becoming light brown and looking like fog kind of spreading through this black background, when in reality it then turns out that it's just a cup of coffee that Freddie has made for her morning as she leaves her motel room. As she's leaving the hotel room, walking down the stairs, walking through the halls, the outdoor hallway because it is a motel, not a hotel, she hesitates. And then we see that there is a detective that she spoke with at the mushroom crime scene who's leaning on a car. She starts moving again, she approaches him, and once she has approached, he confronts her that most of the information that was in her article wasn't from him. And she says that she inferred. He says that his fellow cops think that he told her, and she points out that they all saw him talking to her. He reveals that he's being questioned about Eldon escaping, and with absolutely no remorse, she apologizes for getting him fired. He then looks at her funny, saying he wasn't fired, he was just suspended. But she just tells him that if he wasn't fired yet, he will be, as Jack will make sure of it. He then accuses her of stirring the hornet's nest and getting him stung. So she offers to help him get work at private security, which she promises will pay better. He then realizes that he isn't the first cop that she's gotten fired, and she says that future him will thank her before Eldon walks up and shoots the detective in the head immediately, with no warning, no preamble, no hints, just straight through the head. Eldon then turns the gun and points it at Freddie, who has a little bit of blood splatter on her face, saying that he read her article and asks her to tell him about Will. Now, obviously, we've already commented on it a couple times, but Freddie is completely unethical. Her unethical behavior continues onward and onward, so we don't have to keep harping on it. So I'll just briefly mention it here. And I know this may be horrible of me, but I found this shot so funny because just the suddenness of the shot, like just they're having a conversation, she's saying future him is gonna thank her, and then boom, he's gone, done. And it's just the timing of it, the comedic nature, how literally undangerous and unassuming Eldon looks, and he's just there suddenly, out of nowhere. And when someone dies, it's never funny. But just the way that they shot the shot, the way that it happened on the screen, just the lines that it followed, I found it very comedic. And I don't know if that was intentional or completely by accident, or if I just have a darker sense of humor, which wouldn't be unheard of. But I found that shot very funny. It was actively made me laugh, and it's still, even remembering it now as I'm giving this, making me laugh. I thought it was a really funny shot. And again, I don't know if that was intentional, but given the nature of the show, I feel like it probably was accidental, and it's a me problem. But I think it's worth calling out. Still in the parking lot, but now off to the side, the body of the detective is being removed in the background, and Freddie, who is sitting at the back of an ambulance, calls out to Jack and asks about Will, because Eldon had asked about him. She tells him that Eldon was talking about the properties of a fungus, with thoughts moving from brain to brain, mutating and evolving. She reveals that Will was right, and Eldon is looking for connections in someone who's able to understand him. Jack pushes for more detail, and she says that she told him everything, and that Eldon wants to help Will connect with Abigail, and is planning to bury her. Now, this is a short scene. It doesn't really tell us anything we didn't know. The only comment I have on it is it didn't come through in my summary because I tried to make things more concise. But if you're watching the scene, Freddie takes forever to get to her point that he's going after Abigail to bury her. You'd think that'd be the thing you'd lead with, but she does this whole roundabout, oh, here's what we talked about, here's what we did, blah, 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 and then finally gets to it. And I found it a bit annoying to watch. I'm like, just get to the point already. But I guess they had to pad out the screen time for the scene, so they made her take a while to get there and to kind of say it in a roundabout way. But luckily, you only have to listen to my rambling. You didn't have to actually listen to her rambling because I summarized the scene very concisely for you. Now that we know that Eldon is after Abigail, we now join him as he arrives at the hospital. He enters into a staff-only door and grabs a pair of spare scrubs that somebody's left in there and changes into them. Will, who happens to be wandering the halls of the hospital, gets a call from Jack telling him, or rather warning him, that Eldon knows about Abigail. He then runs back to her room to find that her bed is gone, and Will demands that a nurse tell him where she is, and she says that they took her for tests. When he asks who, the nurse doesn't know, and he starts running through the halls with his gun out. He goes down the stairwell, managing to reach Eldon, who he wounds in the leg before he starts checking Abigail's pulse. He then turns back to Eldon, asking what he was going to do to her, and Eldon answers that, well, he rambles a bit about how they've all evolved from mycelium. He's simply reintroducing her to the concept. He talks about mushrooms. We see some lovely images of mushrooms in the background and connections and lights, and it's very aesthetic. Will then asks, or basically clarifies, that he's going to reintroduce her to this concept by burying her alive. Eldon yells at him that the journalist, Freddie, said that he understood, but Will says that he doesn't. Eldon assures him that he would have if he let him bury her. He then goes on to wax poetic about mushrooms before saying that he should have let him plant her. He'd have found her in a field where she was finally able to reach back. So with this scene, my biggest issue with it is simply that there's no neat little bow tied around it to sum it up well. Question: how did Will know where Eldon would be? How did he know he was going down? Like, where we can assume he was heading out of the hospital, obviously, so maybe that's how Will knew to go downwards in the stairwell. But again, I don't know all hospitals, but most hospitals will have like an outdoor parking lot. There'll be people who park on the streets nearby so they don't have to pay for parking, and then there's usually like an underground parking option. So, because there's usually multiple parkings, there's usually multiple entrances. How did Will know which one Eldon was going for? We can again just kind of use that overall plot sheet of he has an empathy disorder. He just knew intuitively where Eldon was going to be, but that's not told to us as an audience. We're meant to assume it. And then also, was Eldon going to wheel her bed to a field? Just a couple scenes ago, we took his car. We have his car. Now, he could have rented one in the meantime, but I'm pretty sure when you're renting a car, they do some sort of check, and I'm pretty sure he probably has a wanted out on him, so I'm not sure how successful he would have been at renting a car. He might have borrowed one, but I feel like part of the whole mushroom thing, wanting to find a connection, someone who understands, implies that he's not really close to a lot of people, so who's he borrowing a car from? His transportation, his plan, it's kind of left at a loose end. We don't really get that neat bow just kind of wrapping everything up like we do in other series. We're kind of left to wonder and question these things. Of course, in a regular watch through, if you're not watching critically, you probably just don't even care. But when you are watching critically, it leaves you wondering. You want to know. But now we come upon our final set of scenes. Will is in the foreground and is very sharp and defined, very clear on the screen, while Hannibal sits further back and is out of focus. Hannibal asks when Will shot Eldon who he saw. Will points out that he didn't see Garrett Jacob Hobbs. So Hannibal says that it isn't Garrett haunting him, but there being a man so bad that killing him felt good. Will corrects him, saying that killing Garrett didn't feel good, it felt just. Hannibal then continues that he's trying to prove that feeling was from saving Abigail, not killing her dad. But Will says he didn't feel anything wounding Eldon. Hannibal points out that he didn't kill him, so of course he wouldn't feel the same. Will admits that he had thought about killing Eldon and isn't sure that he didn't actually intend to and just miss. Hannibal then tells him that if he intended to kill him, then he understood him. Will says he should have just stuck to fixing boats, which is what his father did, I believe. And then Hannibal says that a boat is a machine. It's predictable and an easy problem to solve. And if he fails, there's always a paddle, asking where the paddle was with Garrett Jacob Hobbs. Will informs him that he was supposed to be the paddle, and Hannibal claims that he is his paddle, and then tells Will it wasn't the act of killing, but he feels bad because it felt good. Will admits that he liked killing Garrett, and he does this after a pause and someone in a whisper. And Hannibal then says that killing feels good to God too, and we are in his image. And then he brings up a roof falling on a church of worshippers which killed 34 people. Will then asks if God felt good when he dropped the roof of the church, and the episode ends on Hannibal saying that he felt powerful. So we'll first address the religious point. Obviously, Hannibal assuming that he could ever know what God, an omnipotent being and deity, could possibly feel is very presumptuous, but Hannibal does have a bit of an ego, and he's not entirely wrong. God does kill all the time, but that doesn't image have the right to do so because God is God, and he is far above humans, even if he has made humans in his image. It would be like the difference between a human and a monkey. Just because God does it doesn't mean you get to do it, is all I want to say on that topic. And now to the part that kind of amuses me. Hannibal, the paddle, the one who is supposed to be helping him, guiding him. Hannibal the paddle who just sat back and watched him kill Garrett, watched him not save the mom, watched him struggle to save Abigail before deciding that, okay, maybe she's worth saving, maybe I can use her for something, and then goes and saves Abigail. He is not a very good paddle, but I don't think that the show means him to be. But I find it funny that Hannibal is claiming he's the paddle when he's the one who literally left him adrift without one. But with that, we will end this episode, and that is the final scene of this episode. So that brings us to the section of the video where we get to rank the episodes. This is my personal favorite part of the episodes, and we rank on two lists. We rank on a personal list, which is purely my opinion, and we rank on a mostly objective list. The reason that it's mostly objective, the objective aspect comes in from the lack of emotional influence on the score. However, the mostly little caveat at the front is because bias and judgment of mine do apply. I made the chart that we use. I decide what on the chart applies. So my bias, my judgment is there. And so now let's get on to the mostly objective ranking. On the mostly objective rank values chart, I've highlighted those that I feel apply to this episode. Firstly, we obviously have our single episode supporting character introduction, and that is Eldon. And he is worth obviously only 1 point. We then also have some multi-season main character development as we learn about Will's past as a cop and that he was stabbed. And so that, of course, is worth 4 points. We then also have the introduction of a multi-season supporting character in Freddie Lowndes, as she does recur throughout this season and many others, and that is worth 3 points. And then we also have a strong plot concept, and the reason that it's strong, honestly, is because of the mushrooms. For a plot to be strong, it's something that also has to be memorable. It's something like when you're years out from watching the series and you're just off the top of your head thinking, what happened in that series? What do I remember from that series? If it's something that pops into your head, especially if it's like the first thing that pops into your head, then in my opinion, it's a very strong plot concept because it's something that was able to stick with you and stay by you. And the mushroom plot, it could just be because mushrooms are my favorite food and I do adore mushrooms that and like they're also very aesthetically cute. Like when you get mushroom patterned clothing or mushroom patterned cookware. I mean, I believe in the 70s there was an entire trend about mushroom patterned kitchenware. Mushrooms are just they're amazing. So I understand and empathize here with this killer. Like, of course, you love mushrooms. Mushrooms are lovable, and the mushrooms make it memorable. So, because that's a strong plot concept and it sticks with you, that also is another 4 points on this chart, which brings us up to 12, which is over 10. However, there is one negative that we need to address, and that is Freddy. Now, I could say negative messaging or behavior, but I feel like that would go on and on and on every episode. So instead, I'm going to mark her as just a weak and dislikable character. Emphasis on the dislikable character aspect. Like her lack of ethics, her lack of morals makes her very dislikable. In future, I don't know that we are actually supposed to dislike her. I think we're supposed to question her, but maybe not dislike her. But I actively dislike her. And I also think that she's a weak character as far as like they use her kind of as a plot device, but the story's really revolving around Hannibal and Will, and they don't really care about the articles. So even if the public gets a bad impression of Will from her articles, I don't see how that would really impact the Will and Hannibal of it all. So again, I don't know that she's entirely necessary. And there were 2 points where they could have gotten rid of her and they chose not to, and that also kind of bothers me. So that's a -4, which then leaves us with our mostly objective score for this episode as an 8 out of a total 10 points. And with 8 out of 10 points, that means that on our mostly objective ranking, it does not beat out the first episode. And so our mostly objective ranking list in first place has Aperitif, and now in the second place has Amuse-Bouche. Now we're going over to my personal ranking. And I agreed with the objective ranking in this case. I agreed that it was an 8 out of 10 episode. It's one of the most memorable. It's one with a very strong plot concept, but it did have some dislikable things. Like, I don't really get the Abigail thing, so all the scenes in the hospital and the why it would matter if Eldon buried her, other than the moral she shouldn't be killed while she's in a coma side of things. I didn't get it. So that took off some points. I also don't like Freddie as a character, so the scenes with her, also not a big fan. But obviously, I loved that this episode kept mentioning a lot of my favorite things. You know, we got my favorite bird, we got my favorite food. I feel like that just makes me happy, and that gives me a positive impression automatically of the episode. And then, of course, I always love Will and Hannibal's interactions as they're talking and doing their back and forth. And I also like that we got to develop Will's character a little bit, and we also got to develop his relationship with Beverly a bit more, as we don't see that as often. But again, because we know the future as this is a rewatch, we know that she and him do have a friendship going forward, and this is the first time we're really seeing them interact. So with all of those positives, there were negatives as well. So again, I agree with the objective in this case, and personally marked it an 8 out of 10. However, in my case, I like this episode better than the first one. So, on my personal ranking list, we have Amuse-Bouche now becoming the #1 episode, and Aperitif is in second place. And finally, I want to thank you for making it this far in the video. This one is a bit of a long one, and we are now at our final section, which is our series rankings so far. Now, in the series, there's multiple seasons. And rather than ranking all of the episodes from all of the seasons against each other, the way that we do things on this channel is we rank each season's episodes against each other, but then we rank the seasons against the other seasons. But how do we know which season is better? That is through a percentage score. So we rank each episode out of 10, and that means for season 1 that there are 13 episodes, so we can get a maximum total score of 130 points. As we go through and we rank each of the episodes, we will add each episode's rank score to the total, and then at the end we'll find the percentage. Don't we just all love math? We'll have to do a lot of it. We will then find the percentage, and obviously the one with the higher percentage rating will of course be the better seasons. And we'll see, once we've completed the series, which seasons are worth watching, which ones maybe fall a little flat, and we'll know a ranking of each season against each other. So, moving on now, our mostly objective ranking for this episode was one of 8, and therefore we are now up to 18 out of 130 for our mostly objective list. And on the personal side, we have added 8 for my personal ranking this time, which has brought us up to 15 out of 130 points. And now with that, we've rewatched and ranked Season 1 of Hannibal, Episode 2, Amuse-Bouche. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.